Hello, welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about cerebellum, its anatomy and also functional anatomy, and also some nucleus which are located in the deep part of the cerebellum, which are called deep cerebellar nuclei. But first of all, I will start with the anatomy and anatomy wise looking at the cerebellum. So imagine this is the central nervous system. Here we have the central sulcus, the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary somatosensory cortex, and also the precentral gyrus, which is the primary somatomotor cortex, and also premotor cortex in here, which the number of them are for the postcentral gyrus, we have number 1, 2, and 3, and 3 has two parts, 3A and 3B. These are the numbers which are dedicated to the cortex, so we will be easier in talking about its functions and also the disorders related to them, and also the pathways. On the other hand, for the premotor cortex, it is number 6, and primary motor cortex, it is number 4. So this is my cerebellum. Cerebellum is in the posterior cranial fossa, and the cortex of the cerebellum is separated from the cortex of the cerebral. So the cerebral cortex is different from the cerebellar cortex, and here, which they connect to each other, is called tentorium cerebelli. It is the part which the cortex of the cerebral is separated from the cerebellum. So cerebellum has 3 different lobes: the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and also follicular nodular lobe, which in each part there are different nucleuses located. And here, as you see, the cortex is folding and just increasing the surface, so increasing its function to be better in the function. On the other hand, on the cortex of the cerebellum, it is gray. It is a gray matter, so it has nucleus in it. It means that the nucleus of the neurons are located in here, which in the next video I'm going to talk about the cortex of the cerebellum more. But just keep in mind that the foldings it is folded, and the foldings are because it wants to increase its function. On the other hand, it is gray. It means that it has nucleuses. So, and also it is unmyelinated, of course. So there are some pathways, which means that the axons will go inside the cerebellum, and they are called the afferent pathways. It means that the cerebellum will receive some tracts. On the other hand, there are some tracts and axons which go out of the cerebellum, which are called the efferent. So we have afferent and also efferent, and in each part we are going to have afferent and also efferent pathways. But totally, if I want to just number the functions of the cerebellum, so then later in the next video I understand the pathways which are dedicated to the cerebellum, I can say that the cerebellum is responsible for the balance and also equilibrium. Balance and equilibrium means what? It means vestibular nucleus. It means vestibular nucleus. And why? Because vestibular nucleus is responsible for the balance and pathway. It means that from the vestibular nucleus, which is located somewhere in here, there are some pathways to the cerebellum. And also, it is responsible for the muscle tone and also coordination and also motor learning. What I mean? There are some proprioceptions, sensory fibers, which will insert to the cerebellum. And also, there are some fibers from the cortex which come down, and they are responsible for the motor movement. But because of the coordination, they will be sent into the cerebellum, and there are some discussions there. And then the result is sent to the cortex again, and finally to the muscles, which all these pathways, I'm going to talk about them. But the thing which was important for me, and it is important so you know it, is this, that there are some pathways from inner ear which are responsible for the balance and equilibrium and is dedicated to the vestibular nucleus, and also proprioceptions, which are the sensation of the outer world. It means that, okay, where is my muscle right now? Or for example, the proprioceptions, which are dedicated to the muscle, and sensory informations about the muscle, about the Golgi tendon organ even, or about the fibers of the muscle. All in all, they will be brought to the cerebellum too, as far as they would be brought to the cortex, to the sensory part of the cortex for decision, to the sensory part of the cortex, so the cortex would receive it. But not only the cortex, but also the cerebellum receives these proprioceptions too, and about the muscle tone also. So about the muscle tone, we can talk about the Golgi tendon organs, and also some fibers which are located deeply inside the muscles, which their information can be brought to the cerebellum. On the other hand, about again the muscles, there are some motor movements which come from the primary somatomotor cortex or pre-motor cortex, which is part 4 and also part 6, to the muscle, but they will go to this cerebellum too, so the coordination happens. So in here I just covered the functions of the cerebellum and also the anatomy wise, but the functional anatomy is located in here, which I'm going to talk about it right now. First of all, I want to clarify what is this. So imagine this is cerebellum, but what are these parts? Well, the cerebellum, I told you, consists of the anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and also follicular nodular lobe, which are separated by some fissures, the primary fissure and also the posterior lateral fissure. So in here I have my primary fissure. So this is the anterior lobe, this is the posterior lobe, but this is anatomical, not functional anatomy, because functional anatomy is a little different. And this is follicular nodular lobe. But the anterior lobe consists of the spinocerebellum tract. What do I mean? I mean that every information from the spinal cord, from the spine, which will be brought, which are the proprioceptions, for example, they will come to the anterior lobe. They are called the spinocerebellum. And this anterior lobe consists of the vermal area and also paravermal area. This is vermus. This is vermus. And in here I have the paravermal area. So this is vermus and the vermal area, and here is the paravermal area. As you see, I have here drawn an alien, which is the homunculus of the cerebellum. What I mean? I mean that, for example, the temporal lobes in here, they are located in paravertebral area. And for example, the eye, the face, the neck, and also the trunk is located in the vermal area. It means that everything which comes from the spinal cord, which is dedicated to the trunk, it will be brought in the vermal area. That's it. I wanted you to know that the spinocerebellum tract, the informations, the sensory informations which come from the spine to the cerebellum, they are dedicated to the trunk, to the neck, to the head, to the eye, for example, lips, anything from the spine, anything will be brought in here, which are dedicated to these parts, will be in the vermal area. And paravermal area are a little temporal lobe, the hands, and also the legs. That's it. So the vermal and paravermal, they are the anterior lobe, but this is the anterior lobe, which is anatomy and functional part. So the anatomical part is a little different from the functional anatomy, because functional anatomy, the anterior lobe consists of a spinocerebellum tracts, which are which are separated to the vermal area and also paravermal area. And in here I have drawn the homunculus, which is dedicated to these acceptance of this sensory information. And in here I have the primary fissure. And in here, as I'm coloring it in blue, this is the posterior lobe. Functional anatomy, posterior lobe. What I mean? For example, the posterior lobe consists of the lateral hemisphere and also cerebrocerebellum. What I mean? I mean that there are some informations from the cerebrocerebellum which comes into the posterior lobe, and the functional anatomy says that this posterior lobe of the functional anatomy, which is in here, the lateral hemispheres, consists of the lateral hemispheres, it will receive informations from the cerebellum. It will receive the information, and these informations are dedicated to the motor informations. And finally, after coordination in here between some nucleuses, it will come back to the sensory part again, and finally for the action it will come down from this motor cortex again. So what happens another time? We have posterior lateral we have posterior lobe. Okay, so this is my posterior lobe. This is my posterior lobe. In here I had my anterior lobe. In here, this is the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe consists of the vermal area, paravermal area. The posterior lobe consists of the lateral hemispheres, and these are responsible for the informations which come from the motor cortex to cerebellum, and from cerebellum again to the sensory part, then to the motor, and finally it will go for the action. That's it. So just in case, I wanted to add that in downer part of this vermal area, we have another homunculus which is dedicated to two people, but their heads are in the vermal, the trunk is on the vermal, but the hands and the legs are in paravermal. Totally paravermal is the hands and legs. In here a little temporal lobe, but mostly hands and legs, and the rest of the body is in the vermal area. It is responsible for coordinations and receiving informations of these parts which I have drawn in here. So in here I have the posterior lateral fissure. As you see, the posterior lateral fissure is in here between the posterior and also follicular nodular lobe. And in here, between the posterior lobe and follicular nodular lobe, I have the posterior lateral fissure. As you see in here, we have the posterior lateral fissure between the posterior and also follicular nodular lobe. So this is the follicular nodular lobe. It has some nucleuses, which I will mention it just right now. But just in case, I want you to know that it is responsible for the vestibulocerebellum tracts. What I mean that it receives informations from the inner ear. Then from the inner ear it will come to the vestibular nucleus, and finally to the follicular nodular lobe. That's it, to the follicular nodular lobe. So I covered everything related to the functional anatomy, to the anatomy itself, and finally right now I want to talk about some nucleuses which are located in the cerebellum. And in the next video I'm going to talk about the cortex of the cerebellum and also some nucleuses which are located there, and some pathways which are the internal and inner pathways inside the cortex between the nucleuses, and also some fibers which are the climbing fibers and also mossy fibers, which I will explain about them completely. And after that I'm going to cover the pathways which are efferent and afferent, which means that they come to the cerebellum and they go out of the cerebellum. But just in case, in order to complete this video, I'm going to talk about the nucleuses. In order to memorize the nucleus of the cerebellum, there is a sentence which helps you, and it is like this: don't eat grassy food. Don't is for the dentate, eat is for embelliform nucleus, grassy is for globus nucleus, and food is for vestigial nucleus. So vestigial nucleus, globus nucleus, emboliform nucleus, and dentate nucleus. So another time, as you see, the dentate nucleus is the outer part. The dentate, we have two. In fact, cerebellum has two hemispheres, so the nucleuses are two. So in here, dentate, they are so external, dentate nucleus, and the dentate, because it is so external, so it is in the lateral hemisphere. The lateral hemisphere was the posterior lobe. So they are located in the posterior lobe, the lateral hemisphere. So they receive informations about cerebellum. It means it receives informations from the cortex, motor cortex down. So the nucleus which is responsible for motor cortex down and then coordination, then sends its opinion upster to the sensory, is the dentate nucleus, and it is located laterally as you see, to the lateral hemisphere, and in here the lateral hemisphere and cerebellum. So the next one, the next two nucleuses, both of them together are called interposed nucleus. But the outer one is emboliform. Don't eat emboliform. It has emboliform. And finally, globus nucleus and globus nucleus. And emboliform and globus, there are in the vermal and paravermal. So this is vermal, this is paravermal, and I told you the anterior lobe consists, the functional anatomy is vermal, paravermal, and it has two nucleuses in here as I have written, but there is another nucleus too, which I will tell it right now, but two of them are emboliform and globus, which you see. The globus, for example, is vermal, emboliform is a little paravermal, but both of them are anterior lobe, and anterior lobe means spinocerebellum trax. It means that it's receiving proprioceptions from the spine. It means proprioceptions. It means sensory sensory receptors. It means that informations about our outer world, about proprioception. It means the location of the muscles, tendon, about tendon, Golgi organ even. Which is located in the tendon, which I have talked about it in another video, and it exists in the channel right now. You can go and watch it. So it receives informations from these parts, and the nucleus is emboliform, and also the globus. Globus is inner, paravermal and vermal, and paravermal is another one, emboliform. And these are two of them called interposed nucleus. Another nucleus is fastigial nucleus. Fastigial is innermost nucleus, and so it is in the folliculonodular lobe, and also a little of it in the vermal lobe. So folliculonodular lobe, and also a little of it in the vermal lobe. And it is responsible for the vestibulocerebellum tract. So it was everything I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the cortex of the cerebellum, the layers, the nucleus, and it's so interesting. And another video, I'm going to complete this journey for the cerebellum and talk about the pathways, the efferent and some afferent pathways, which I try to be a little complete in this area. So all in all, thank you about watching this video. See you in the next video about the layers of the cortex.